resisting dealing with it, so that when the next thing comes and you haven't worked through any of those feelings, they come back with vengeance, right?
Welcome to Decoding Grief with Andrew and Gary, where we explore the complex and often messy journey of grief, highlighting the different ways in which individuals experience and process grief. So let's get started. Well, today we have our guest with us, and that's going to be Steve Troisi. He's the minister at the Grace Lutheran Church here in Boone. And Steve, we'd love to hear you tell us about, I think we talked before about accumulated grief as our first episode journey here of more specific things. So you want to tell us a little bit about you? And
Oh, sure. Yeah. Who am I? I've been a Lutheran pastor for just over 15 years now and served 3 different congregations: Somerville, Austin, Texas, and here in Boone for the last 7, actually more than 7 years now. And prior to that, I kind of grew up in a combination of Pennsylvania and South Carolina, and have 3 kids, 8th grade down to 1st grade. And so we're busy always. But yeah, in terms of grief, I think maybe how I ended up on here is Gary and I were talking, and I think I had said something along the lines of, I had a startling realization. I was 26 when I was ordained, which is in the Lutheran tradition about as young as you could be, I guess, unless you graduated somewhere early along the way. But if you just were like a normal 26, and was pastor of, I was just luckily the second pastor. They didn't set me free on a whole church by myself back then. But I became aware of the fact that I was one of the experts in death, meaning that when a member of the congregation had a death in their family, there were certain people that they would turn to who were the experts in death. Maybe the funeral director could be one of them. Hospice could be another one, or maybe the hospital staff, and then the pastor. And I did not understand that role early on because I hadn't experienced a lot of loss at that point in time. And so that became a pretty startling thing for me in terms of, at least early on, grief was something I was learning about alongside of my parishioners. Well, at the same time, they were looking for me for some guidance about how to grieve well or how to shoulder a loss.
was this grief mostly death kind of grief, or were there other flavors that people were grieving from, other types of things?
I mean, the truth is that there were other things, and people were probably wanting more from me in those spaces, and I did not have a frame of reference for it. So in my mind, I'm thinking about death like funeral deaths. I mean, we probably did, that first church I served was a little bit older and a little bit bigger, and we probably did 30 or more funerals a year, which is about one every other week or so. I can remember
from individuals in the church.
From the congregation. Yes. The senior pastor went on sabbatical, and we had 3 funerals in 2 days on a Saturday-Sunday combo. And luckily there was a retired pastor who I didn't even know that I needed help. And he just sort of said, "Let me come help you here." And so he preached one of them and then helped with presiding at all 3 of those funerals, plus the Sunday services. But we did a lot of funerals, and it was a bit of a crash course in trying to figure out how to navigate loss. But to your point about other kind of losses, there definitely were. I just don't know if I had a field of vision for it. So maybe people were even asking for more from me, and I just didn't even know or missed it. Yeah.
Are they teaching you in your trainings before or your schooling, like how to deal with grief and how to deal with, like, how to do funerals and stuff?
Yeah, I think we had a class called Death, Dying, and Other Losses. It would have been like a 3-hour credit pastoral care course that focused on kind of death, dying. And I think there were other losses. It was called Other Losses, and I assume those other losses were things like, loss of a job or, dissolving of a marriage or something like that. I'm sure those things were in the coursework, but I at the top of my head, I don't remember it, but we did have a whole class, and then even things like, how do you do a funeral?
Do you feel like, so like I had a leadership position really early on in work at like 23 years old. And so like, I felt like I had to learn a lot on the fly, but because like people were looking at me like, oh, you're the leader now, you're the boss now, you know how to do this thing. And it's like, no, I've never ran this before, but is that now that you're, a pastor, we look at it even more like, oh, you're going to have all the answers. You have all the answers of life, and you have all the answers of death, and you have all the answers of all that. That has to be a huge,
Yeah. No, it's very true. So when I moved from the associate pastor position to like a head pastor kind of role, I was 29. So I was a little bit older, but I was 26 to 29. And that I was definitely not ready to be in charge. Yeah. And
what do you mean by not ready?
I mean that I still wasn't even sure who I was as a pastor at that point in time. I was still figuring out how, like, what do I really care about? Not what the seminary professors or things like that. Like, what is my perspective in ministry? How do I manage a staff was not even on my frame of reference. In fact, I showed up and I was like, oh, I guess the staff is looking to me for answers. And I wasn't really sure what those were. So most of that was pretending like I knew what I was doing, right? The old kind of fake it till you make it.
Feel like you had enough experiences in life. I think you alluded to this already, but did you feel like you had enough experiences in life to be able to help other people who were going through great loss?
Yeah.
And if not, how did you gain that? Yeah. And what kind of tools did you learn to be able to help people to go through those kinds of things?
Yeah. Early on, it was whatever they taught us in seminary to say, which is so the first day of pastoral care in seminary, not the death and dying class, that was like a more advanced pastoral care class, just basic pastoral care. The first thing they teach you day one, they call it ministry of presence, which is just don't say anything. Like, please don't say anything. Just show up. And I think they do that because, like, almost immediately you'll be in a situation where you're going to show up in a collar. We start wearing clerical collars in seminary, and people are going to expect that you know what you're doing, and you have exactly 1 week more of seminary than they do. And so better to just be quiet and show up and let the office speak. And so
so that was a great thing to dive into a little bit if we could. So what are people who are in this, in the case of loss, of death of a family member or whatever, what do they teach you in seminary that they need? It sounds like they need someone. They're not able to actually manage it themselves as well as they'd like, and they're looking for someone to guide them. Is that why you would show up that way? So that you can be a figure that they can hang on to as they work through this, or that even cross your mind?
Yeah, I think sometimes that's the case. I think it might depend on your relationship with the person too. That if you're the pastor, they're going to expect you to have the pastor words. That's an area I still struggle with. Like, if I show up and they need me to speak the pastor words, that's just not the vernacular I use. I think probably, especially being in place as long as I've been here in Boone, when people call me to tell me somebody's dying or that somebody has died, I don't think they need the pastor words. I think they just want to, they actually don't know what they need. They just know they're falling, sinking, whatever, the darkness is surrounding. And they've reached out to one person who they know will be there. And so I show up and I give them a hug. And then mostly I don't say a whole lot. Even to this day, I try not to. Because everything I'm going to say is not going to work. So, but I think more so people call because they don't know who else to call. Mm-hmm. So it's the middle of the night. your spouse has died. I need to tell people this. I've called my kids or whomever I need to call. Who else do I need to call? And I hope folks have my cell phone number and know they can call me. And that I'm one that would, get up in the middle of the night and show up, so that as you're sinking, there's at least someone there with you.
I mean, I think going through my grief, like, it's so profound that you said that was like the first day of that. It was like, just show up. And like, I could tell you exactly who showed up. Like when my mom died, like I can tell you exactly who showed up. I can also tell you exactly who I would call, and I know that they would show up. And I always talk about, like, through grief is like, I didn't want like the BS answers. I didn't want the fake answers. I didn't want don't worry, it's going to get better. Don't worry, you'll get over this. Don't worry, it's going to take time.
She's in a better place.
She's in a better place. This is what happens and stuff like this. This is life. Yeah. All that was just like, oh, I'm sick and tired of that. And like, it was always like, oh, how's your dad doing? Oh, I'm sure he's doing much better now. It's been a couple weeks. Or this and this. Like, no, do you want me to be honest? Like, I wanted the people around me that I could be honest with. Like, no, it's not good right now. It sucks. This is terrible. I am not good right now. And that's all I wanted. So like you talk about, like, I didn't want the pastoral answers. I didn't want the, like, just tell me what you tell everyone. I wanted just someone there to, like, be there. I tell volunteers sometimes just being in the presence, like, even if they're sleeping and sitting there and reading a book, you just, occupying the emptiness is huge for people.
I like that term. I like that. Occupying the emptiness. Yeah. I guess I have a growing concern that we've decided we can do everything by ourselves, not just grief, but all things. Yeah. And it leads to a lot of isolation. And in grief, it's particularly...
when that happens, you mentioned this when we first started talking about this a few weeks ago, about this accumulated grief. And can you explain that a little bit so that our listeners would understand what that is?
I don't know where I've stolen this from. Most everything I say, I've stolen from somebody else. So all credit goes to other people. If it's insightful, it came from someone else. But I think it comes from this idea that grief doesn't actually go away. It's not over.
But time heals all wounds.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. The stages of grief.
Absolutely.
Success.
Absolutely.
These prescriptive stages of grief. Yeah. Not descriptive, but prescriptive. Yeah. This is the exact stage you'll go through each time.
And everyone's the same.
And you'll spend this much time on each one. Yeah. And that's the prescription. And that's nothing like grief at all. Yeah. And you'll circle back and do other ones. So go ahead. Yeah.
So it doesn't go away. So every grief, every kind of loss, all kind of stacks together. And so every time you have a significant loss, it connects back to every other loss you've ever had. And so it also makes you who you are too, right? If we're being honest and vulnerable, right? That's sort of the anatomy of what's within our souls, is this combination of losses. And yet we still find a way to move forward, right? But, and so I think sometimes we don't give account to that. We think, okay, well, that loss happened 10 years ago. So, okay, well, that's done. Now we're going to face the next one, and then we'll get that one done. And as opposed to this fact that you have one loss and it pulls you right back in to where you were before. Or you walk with a friend. I mean, even holding space for other people, I think that was the language or something you were using, that pulls you back into your own grief too. And as one who gives care or tries to be a presence, that's also very emotionally taxing, in terms of how do I recognize that I'm walking with these people through a grief that's not as closely connected to who I am, but it's pinging off all of these other grief and loss that I've had.
Because you're human.
Yeah. But isn't that maybe what the connection is? Yeah. Isn't that why you're in the room? Yeah. And so we think, oh, you've got to be the caregiver. You have to have the answer. You have to be the one who's healed and whole and over it all already, so that you can show them how to do it. And the truth is that their loss is bringing you back down into yours again. And
Even if you managed yours in an effective way, it's still there's still something that still lingers. Or Andrew and I wouldn't be talking about the loss of our parents or whatever. And so the accumulated grief, what does that show up like later?
Yeah, well, it usually is talked about in terms of grief that you've sort of set aside, and you've kind of found a way not to face, which sometimes gets a bad rap. Like, oh, you're just not dealing with it. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes it's too much to take head on. And you watch that with kids that grieve, right? They're sort of in it, and then they're out of it, and then they're in it, and they're out of it. And I think that's how we're designed to face grief. So it's okay to kind of be in and out of it. The problem is when you're just out of it all the time and you're resisting dealing with it. So that when the next thing comes and you haven't worked through any of those feelings, they come back with vengeance, right?
Yeah. I'm just going to stuff it. I'll deal with it later. I'll deal with it later. And then you have the next episode and I'll deal with it later. And this is, again, goes back to that these stages of grief are descriptive, not prescriptive. So you could get through stage 2, stage 3, and then you bounce back to stage 2 again. And you spend some more time there, and then you move forward, and then you go back because something triggered you and a memory or whatever, and you're going back and you're constantly running back. That's how I've heard it explained. So we talk about, in this case, somebody who stuffs, who doesn't deal with it, and then it piles on, and what happens?
Then it explodes, yeah.
Over something very small, nothing even, it's just there's so much accumulated that the smallest little thing, now it blows up. And have you seen that happen with people?
Well, yeah, of course.
And what does that look like?
Oh. Yeah. We are a church, and so sometimes people do get angry about relatively minor things. And so you sort of wonder yourself, well, why are we so angry about this relatively small thing? And I think that's usually the way it comes out, is that you have sort of a bigger reaction, but you also, in some ways, are losing control over your ability to react or respond. Meaning like you're just reacting and it's coming from somewhere deep within and you're seeing red and you don't even know why you're seeing red, right? And some of that is that grief working itself out. In congregational ministry settings, we sort of have to balance this because in some sense, that's kind of good. People need to find an outlet for it. And the flip side, you can't go around yelling at everybody because the tablecloth's the wrong color or the centerpiece wasn't quite right.
Right. So that's the kind of thing that would trigger somebody that possibly was just had layers and layers of grief that had never been resolved. Yeah. And then the tablecloth is not even on all the sides for the gathering we're having in the fellowship hall. Yeah. And I often think, and I think I learned this from, again, many different places, but the idea of, instead of wondering what's wrong with that person, is to say, I wonder what happened to that person. Because something happened to them that is likely piling all that in there that they've not finished dealing with. And then we get this accumulated grief where it's just one little thing. The tablecloth was wrinkled and now it's a disaster and we have yelling.
I think sometimes it also affects the stories we tell about ourselves, to ourselves, about who we are. And grief has a way of, unreconciled grief has a way of us distorting our story a little bit as a way to avoid it. So the narrative of who we are in this life, who we are we the superhero, whatever our narrative is about ourselves. Unreconciled grief, we have to kind of drive around that whole, so we have to sort of mangle our story around because we have not gotten to a place where we can just face it and understand how it fits into the narrative of our own lives, if it were like a story. And so we sort of, circle around these things and we tell these half truth of who we really are because we can't.
We don't want to face.
Yeah.
We don't want to face the bad or to face the wrong, because that makes us, something's wrong with us then. And like, it's the thing of like, why not go to therapy? It's always because I don't want to, because if I go to therapy, I'm admitting that there's something wrong with me, or I'm admitting that stuff like that. Like, why this is the reason we do this part 2 is like, why guys don't talk about this. It's like, no, but people don't want to hear this from us, or like, we don't want our wives to know about this, or our kids to know about this, because we're supposed to be the strong one. We're supposed to be the one. My daughter a couple weeks ago said to me, like, Dad, I've never seen you cry. And I was like, obviously you don't remember 3 years ago when I was crying about my mom being sick and having cancer and dying. Like, she didn't see those things. She don't remember those things. But to her dad, her superhero, he doesn't do that. He doesn't cry. He doesn't get, he's not hurt. He doesn't have those emotions, And as a guy, I always feel like, you're right, I'm not supposed to have those emotions. I'm not supposed to show you that. Like, I talk about grief of like, that first year of losing my mom, I don't feel like I showed it that much. It was like, oh, Andrew's doing well. Like, he's not doing too bad. It's his dad, or it's family members, or stuff like that. That's who we need to really pour into. And I say, like, the second year was harder for me than the first year, because the first year I felt like I had to be strong for every single person in my life. Like, they don't need me to be emotional. I need to be strong for them. Let them be emotional now. And then the second year, it's like, well, everyone stopped asking about it or talking about it. And so now it's like, it's hitting me more now from little things that was happening.
There's also a loneliness there too, right? Because everybody else's lives have sort of gone back to normal, and yours can't. Yeah. And so you carry that with you, but you don't want to be like, you want to pull everybody back down into it all the time. Like, well, by the way, I had this big loss. Don't forget, right? Don't forget. You can't just go back to normal. The truth is that everybody is carrying some level of that loss with them. At least the people you're coming in contact with, that also know the person you lost. But like, your life is just not the same, and it can't be the same. And it seems like everybody else in the world has just continued, and you're sort of falling behind in a way. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of a conversation with Pastor Steve Troisi. Join us next week for part 2, where we discuss more ways grief can accumulate in your life, including in your jobs. Remember, in grief, you are not alone.